roots of American Indian advocacy and activism. So I'm going to start out with what is Red Power, because it's an important component of my presentation. Before establishing the main actors and purpose of my paper, I need to provide you with a brief overview of the rise of American Indian activism and Red Power. In 1944, Native Americans formed the National Congress of American Indians as the first major intertribal association. Among the group's primary concerns were the protection of American Indian land rights and improved educational opportunities for Native Americans. This organization was a proponent of American Indian advocacy by American Indians for American Indians. Beginning in the early 1950s, groups of American Indians protested and resisted the efforts by state power and authority to convert reservation land into the reservoirs. In 1961, a militant new Indian organization, the National Indian Youth Council, appeared and began to use the phrase Red Power, which I will be using throughout the presentation to refer to this movement. They sponsored demonstrations, marches, and fish-ins to protest state efforts to abolish Indian fishing rights guaranteed by federal treaties. So I'm going to focus on modern manuscript materials which I used for the research of this project. In the fall of 2012, I came across the records of the Chicago Indian Council fire at the Ayer Modern Manuscript Collection at the Newberry Library in Chicago, Illinois. The ICF, as it is going to be now referred to for the rest of the presentation, was active as an American Indian advocacy group from the early 1920s through the 1970s. During my 4 months of research at the library, I searched through 5 boxes of the organization's uncatalogued material, which means that there was no finding aid and there was no sort of reference for me. I had to sort of dig in with no guidance. From the primary source documents, newspaper articles, letter correspondences, personal notes, and records, I began to construct a narrative that told the story of the ICF's fluctuating affinity with the Chicago American Indian community. The information from these documents, when contextualized with US politics and policies of the 20th century, illustrates why there was a push by the American Indian population to reclaim their identity and rights independently in the 1960s and 1970s, and how this was a different direction from the earlier generation of American Indian activists and advocates. So I'm going to put up my thesis so you can follow along. It's quite long. My thesis for the paper was that the timing, purpose, and vision of Red Power can be best explained as a pushback by a young generation against the early roots of American Indian activism and advocates, who were responsible for the construction of American Indian identities from the 1920s to the 1950s. Thus, using the perspectives of early American Indian advocates and activists, we are able to synthesize how the divergent perspectives that dominated local and national politics of American Indians shaped the American Indian Red Power movement of the 1960s and 1970s. So, a little more fleshed out, the Indian Council Fire's relationship with the local American Indian community, as well as the greater community, gives the American Indian urban experience more impetus and explains some of the original factions within these advocacy groups that precipitated Red Power and its platform of generating a national conscience for its movement. The disparities in the organization were caused by the external federal policies, as well as a growing divide between American Indian advocates and American Indian community members regarding the American Indian urban experience and their tribal identities. I will explore several of the federal policies that were crucial in shaping the urban experience of American Indians in the 20th century, as well as several disparities among American Indian activists and advocates who projected a particular identity for American Indians. And so I'm going to refer to some termination and relocation policies, as well as introduce you to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It is important to note that the Bureau of Indian Affairs was created in 1820 to oversee the Indian problem, as it was referred to by the government at that time, but it became the branch of the Department of the Interior that developed policy towards Native Americans. In 1953, Congress enacted Public Law 280, known as the Termination Act, to grant certain states criminal jurisdiction over American Indians on reservations and to allow civil litigation that had come under tribal or federal court jurisdiction to be handled by state courts. The law eliminated most government support for Indian tribes and ended protected trust status of Indian-owned lands. Then, in 1956, Congress passed the Relocation Act, which was designed to encourage Native Americans to leave the reservation, acquire vocation skills, and assimilate into the general population. This led to a mass exodus of reservations to urban centers, including Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, Cleveland, and Seattle. Those who relocated were incentivized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs with help for housing and employment. However, many of the Native Americans struggled to adjust to their new surroundings, facing unemployment, low-end jobs, racism, discrimination, and a lack of support towards traditional cultural practices. Although relocation had been the unofficial Bureau of Indian Affairs policy since 1948, its impact on the American Indian population was realized by 1960, when a total of 33,466 Indians had been relocated. So what else has been said about this topic? I did have to do a thorough secondary literature review for my paper just to see what else had been said and to connect it to my archival material. Many American Indian scholars have focused on the urbanization of the American Indian and the effects of assimilation to mainstream urban culture. The processes of urbanization, when unraveled in a policy context, reveals the importance of the urban Indian identity. This identity encompasses the struggles and difficulties faced by adapting to mainstream American culture in the city. Through the study of American Indian scholarship, identity is affirmed as a crucial element to the splintering of the Indian Council Fire organization, as I referred to earlier in the presentation. In their scholarship, authors Donald Fixico and James Mucha draw important connections between the labels, stereotypes, and prejudice in the history of the American Indian. They claim that the underlying labels, stereotypes, and prejudice in American Indians' lives shaped the experience of the majority of migrant Indians in the cities to be negative. American Indians were accosted with adversities that were difficult to overcome by their own merits. The personal struggles of many Indians who experienced problems of racism, social discrimination, fear, cultural alienation, and the loss of their native identity were made significant in the historical context of federal Indian policies. To overcome these inherent struggles of the American Indian population, they looked to Indian organizations. This became problematic when the vision of these organizations differed from those American Indian populations. In some, these authors claim that the organizations lost legitimacy when they were unsuccessful in recognizing the need for self-determination for the urban Indians' tribal identity, separate from the one constructed for them by institutions. The validity of this argument is limited by the historical perspectives that construct this particular narrative and how it lacks the perspective and experiences of local American Indian organizations who bridged the indigenous and non-indigenous urban communities in the 20th century. The existing discourse surrounding the roots of American Indian activism demonstrates the importance within American Indian studies to independently construct history of American Indians from mainstream narrative that focus on the existence of the majority population. That is, American Indian history should be considered independently from the Anglo-Saxon narrative that dominates history books and congressional acts. And so to help sort of digest, that doesn't come out very clear, sorry about that, digest my thesis and break it down into 3 different parts, I established some critical questions that help navigate essentially my project and my paper. Critical question 1 is, why was there a push by the American Indian population to reclaim their identity as one nation and their rights independently in the 1960s and 1970s? So at the heart of Red Power was a pushback against the work of early American Indian organizations such as the ICF. Members of the movement considered the identity formation, labels, and work of the organizations to be problematic and misrepresentative. The platform of the ICF was that the regressive policies of the federal government from the 19th and 20th centuries perpetuated an assimilationist stance, focused on supporting the integration of American Indians into urban life. The ICF represented an alternative to this assimilationist perspective, promoting integration and adaptation to mainstream culture while maintaining tribal aspects of American Indians' identity. The Indian Council Fire believed that the American Indian should not have to assimilate, give up, or compromise his or her tribal identity to survive or succeed in an urban setting. They did not characterize American Indians as being weak because of their race, but rather because of the position that the federal government had put them in. Many American Indians were, quote, just off the reservations with no previous knowledge of the my apologies, of urban living. This exposed the Indian in a way that the ICF saw as inexcusable. It thus dedicated itself to alleviating the vulnerability and speaking out against the federal government. The counterposition of the Indian Council Fire to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, as I mentioned earlier, would be a point of contestation between the local organization and the federal government. It's imperative to note that the federal tribal narrative to understand the discrepancies that arose between the local Indian organizations and the federal government in the 20th century. Though the ICF prided itself on being an Indian advocacy organization and working on behalf of the entire American Indian population, their goals were well-intentioned but ultimately unrealistic. As the organization narrowed its focus and retreated from an Indian cultural advocacy group to one centrally focused on the Indian Achievement Award, which was a prestigious award that it granted to a member of the American Indian community as it saw fit, and that discretion was considered sort of elitist, the organization forfeited its legitimacy in the eyes of the Indian community. Whether or not the organization was aware of this gradual isolation remains unclear. However, the shifting attitude of the American Indian population in the 1950s, 60s, and 1970s demonstrated a reaction from both members of the Indian Council Fire and the Indian community in regards to the ICF's narrow focus. Critiques for the ICF from both inside and outside the American Indian community ultimately labeled the organization as an adversary for American Indians rather than an advocate, becoming a narrow-focused and elitist organization. The rejection of the ICF and other American Indian organizations by American Indian community members demonstrates the roots of self-determination, the reclaiming of tribal sovereignty and tribal identity that stood at the core of the principles of Red Power and the American Indian movement of the 1960s and 1970s. So my second critical question is, why do we look at the Red Power movement separately from other radical and visible groups who called for the fair and equal treatment of minorities in the United States? When looking at the objectives of the civil rights movement and Red Power, a distinctive connection can be drawn between the movements regarding the importance of national awareness. Red Power's determination to evoke a heightened awareness about the mistreatment and prejudice against American Indians as a minority population is similar to the pushback against institutionalized racism and exclusionary policies of the federal government against African Americans through segregationist politics and Jim Crow. The pioneers of Red Power, American Indian college-age students, led the movement to focus on sovereignty of all American Indians. Overwhelmingly, they blamed the US federal policies of the 20th century for perpetuating a culture of failure, desperation, and dependency for their communities. This sentiment manifested into a broader social movement, one that focused its efforts on reclaiming tribal lands and creating a broader awareness of the experience of the 20th century American Indian. American Indian youth asserted their own identity and acted together as one nation. This self-proclaimed independence led to a movement of empowerment and a rise in Native activism. The rise of activism occurred on the backs of American Indian organizations that, for half a century, had met the needs of the tribal Indians who were foreign to the urban environment. However, there was a strong disconnect between the activists of the 1960s and the early work of these organizations. Both the civil rights movement and Red Power aimed to shock the nation into awareness of their plight. Just as the sit-ins had grabbed the national attention of the public, Red Power employed confrontational tactics that shaped the militant movement. Groups of activists seized federal lands in a number of cities and squatted there in hope of bringing national attention to the housing, welfare, and economic issues that they were suffering from. Most famous of these seizures was Alcatraz Island in California in 1969. The seizures were symbolic of federal treaties that the government had not upheld, as well as other broken promises. However, the media responded by characterizing these issues as illegal and militant, thus shaping public opinion to think that Red Power was only a radical movement. And for the purpose of this paper, I argue that the actions of Red Power were not dissimilar from other groups involved in the civil rights movement, but because it was for Native activism, the media shaped the movement to be between American Indians and the federal government, rather than a national issue. My third critical question is looking at the case study of Chicago, Illinois. How was the American Indian community treated? How did the reaction of the community to federal policies and local advocacy and activism speak to the larger national rhetoric or lack thereof? And since my research was primarily on Chicago, that's why I included this. So for Chicago specifically, I put up two images. The American Indian Center was a center that was separate from the Indian Council Fire, but another option for advocacy in the early 1930s. And I just want to point out that these images, although old and showing newspapers and modern manuscripts, are still very prevalent today. And if you were listening to the presentations earlier today, I just want to reference that many of these issues are still prevalent. So the rise of in activism symbolized the reassertion of the Indians' voice about their experience as second-class citizens in the United States. The Indian activists in the 1970s called for a nationalist movement against the federal government and malicious and paternalistic policies that had robbed the Indian population of land ownership for over a century. In Chicago, there was a polarized response from the members of the American Indian organizations for the division that occurred between those who were for the Bureau of Indian Affairs intervention and those who wanted nothing to do with it. In many of these organizations, the divide elicited two schools of thought regarding intervention or assimilation as best practices towards American Indians. By the 1960s, there was a distinct opposition within the Chicago Indian community for collaborating and working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Those most invested in opposing the Bureau of Indian Affairs and government joined together. The Chicago Indian Village represents a change in the perspective by the American Indians about their identity. The ICF ultimately failed to accurately address the needs of the urban Indian population because their own vision for the population. Unfortunately, the ICF's agenda outweighed the needs of the local American Indian population. The ICF did not support the squatter village, which began after a young American Indian mother of 4 was evicted from her home. Their organization considered the actions of Red Power groups radical and thus anything associated with it. The Chicago Indian Village is an important symbol for the splintering discourse surrounding American Indian identity in the 1970s. Not only did the ICF reject the squatter village, but also those in the village rejected the ICF as an elitist organization that was just another bureaucratic tool for the federal government. Okay. And I've posted my conclusion up on the board for you so you can follow along because, again, it is long. But what I wanted to essentially get at through my paper and my project, that in the height of the Indian Council Fire's work as an Indian advocacy organization, it perpetuated a culture of assimilation. The rejection of Native Americans' tribal sovereignty through its selection of exclusive members, promotion of awards and activities. Red Power indirectly rejected the work of the ICF by changing the approach for American Indian activism and pushing back against government policies. It accomplished this through the promotion of community activism and a cohesion for American Indians as one nation. So through an exploration of the early work of the Indian Council Fire and other American Indian organizations, as explained, an explanation takes shape. These early organizations are instrumental in explaining why the emergence of Red Power and the American Indian movement are rooted in the early advocacy work of American Indian organizations in the 1920s and 1930s, but also how the US federal government policies that shaped the urban experience of American Indians is prevalent. When analyzed together, these two distinct periods of history reveal a common idea, that Red Power was the culmination of a reaction to the historical injustices committed against American Indians in tandem with a new generation taking ownership and a direction to reclaim their sovereign and tribal identity. Although the Red Power was not exactly analogous with the splintering of the ICF, the divergence in advocacy between the two distinct generations demonstrates that the shift in attitude experienced within the local Chicago American Indian community about identity was not unique, but rather that it was occurring on a national level in many major cities. The large-scale conversation about American Indian identity in the 1960s and 1970s had evolved due to the population's pushback against the federal government's termination and relocation policies in the 1950s. Thank you. Sure. Let's see if I can flip back to show you some of them. Oh, that's some. So the Ayer collection at the Newberry Library consists of 5 boxes, so that's 5 times, it's like over 100 pounds of material. And so what I did is get access to those boxes, and I essentially sifted through uncatalogued, which means that they were not organized by time period, they were not organized by content, they were not organized really in any way, and sort of tried to create a narrative from what these materials were telling me. So the image down below is actually of a scrapbook that Marie Lafreniere, who's in the picture, who was one of the presidents of the Indian Council Fire, put together. And so she would compile all of the notes, all of the images, anything that was pertinent to her time as president, and put them in an artistic sort of display. And then that newspaper articles are, yes, in print, but they were also microfilm, so I spent a lot of time going through about 50 years of newspaper articles to try and see what was being published about American Indians and how the role of media was shaping a particular narrative for the public and how that differed from inside the organization, and to see how those constructs either were divergent or similar, which was sort of the main purpose of my paper, to explore that divergence. Yes?
Camilla, I guess I'm curious about, I was struck by your second question.
Sure.
And I guess one of the things I've been trying to think about relative to the Indian Council fire is, it seems to me that there's complexity in the case of the American Indian population in the 1920s and the move to the cities around the awareness of the cultural practices.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
so I guess I'm curious about how you think about the sort of cultural question that is present, it seems to me, in a way, within the American population that isn't as much a part of the discussions of African American population at the same point in time, sort of the 1920s.
Definitely.
And how you see that shaping sort of then both the sort of Indian Council fire and then sort of the 1960s.
Sure. Definitely. And I think complexity best describes my my barrier in engaging with this topic, is that it's such a dense history and trying to even understand the relationship between different decades. So just to address that, I have to go back to the 1910s and explain something about the Carlisle Schools for children that were constructed by the federal government to take children off the reservation and put them in these schools where they essentially were taught American practices, how to dress, how to eat, how to speak, how to walk. And it was the idea that assimilation would occur when tribal culture was stripped. And that was sort of the condition of it. And so in the 1920s, when you have these organizations that are forming to sort of say, hey, we want to preserve this culture, how can we do that? It was still coming from many advocates who had not experienced that culture, who their identity was separate from that. And so the pushback from those who got involved, who were American Indians, were saying, you cannot say that your perception of identity is the same as ours, because those cultural practices aren't inherent. The significance is purely sort of it's more about the show, the idea that we're going to support this group. And so specifically within Chicago, that was a major discrepancy. And the American Indian Center that I mentioned, it's actually on the, right there, they were more about preserving that culture and allowing the forum and the space to create an area where American Indians could demonstrate their culture. But cultural practices, like I said, not just through education were stripped, but also through having sort of specific work jobs, or jobs for work, as well as sort of the monetary component of having to be somewhere from 9 to 5. It was a different type of practice. So that is definitely, going into the 1930s, an issue, but it didn't really become as prevalent until the 1950s, when the huge mass exodus of reservation brought individuals to the cities. I think we're good. There we go, Bill. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a really good point. You brought up John Trudell. So I've talked a lot about history, but specifically to the Red Power movement, you've got this generational divide of those who are the children or grandchildren of individuals who were a part of the reservation culture, and those who were just sort of born into this urban experience and were rejecting all of the forced identities associated with it. And John Trudell was a poet and an activist who really rejected being taken and forced into this identity as an urbanized American Indian. Yes, exactly. And so a lot of secondary literature focuses on that urbanization identity, as I touched on, and really sort of that forced hand. But I would say that that experience, separate from the reservation, it was about reclaiming this tribal identity for those who had that experience and those who were removed, and creating this sort of one nation concept. And in the 1960s and 1970s, Red Power, it was college-age students who had been the grandchildren or the children of those on the reservation who were saying, we want access to this identity, and so far we're feeling these institutional barriers preventing us from really accessing it. And so how do we go back reclaiming it? And it was through, sit-ins and Alcatraz and movements like that they began to make it a national issue. Yes, Scott.
As you come to sort of develop the depth of your thinking around this topic, you're drawing from original sources literature. Can you just say a word or two about insights that you gained from those sources and how it is that they've come together as research methods?
Definitely.
To generate a whole?
Yes. Well, going through from the primary source documents from the Modern Manuscript collection, it was discovering sort of my narrative through that was informing my position on how I felt personally about these Indian advocacy groups and the roles that they had. But combining that with secondary literature, I was forced and challenged by many American Indian scholars who were American Indians whose position as a scholar came and was motivated by their own familial experiences. And so I really had to step back as a student and say, okay, how am I constructing something from original material and then taking the opinions, the perspectives, the observations of these scholars and putting that together and still maintaining my position as an outsider almost. And it's a whole other cultural component to say that I wanted to study this scholarship. However, I needed to recognize that my interpretation of material would be different because of my own position, as well as my reading of the other scholars in secondary literature. And so I'd say that the methodology over the past now year and a half has been really going through and saying, okay, I see this idea, how do I relate it from my own perspective and my own policy now background, because this has become a policy paper from a history paper, and translating that, which has been difficult. So.
I think I have to put an end to this. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.